Hey everybody, Trey here, back with what should be the final update for our severe weather event that is expected to begin within the next few hours as of the time I'm recording this and go through the day tomorrow, which is Friday, January 12th. Now, there have been a few changes to the SPC outlooks since our last video yesterday on this event, and even since my post this morning that I put up on the channel. So let's go ahead and dive right in and show you who is in and who's out as far as the new outlook lines go. So this is our current outlook for the rest of this evening, tonight, and into tomorrow morning. We have an enhanced risk level 3 out of 5 centered on that ArkLaTex area. So places like Shreveport, Texarkana, Hot Springs, Arkansas, up to almost the Little Rock metro area in central Arkansas, and areas in between under the gun for the greatest severe threat. Again, starting within the next few hours as I'm recording this. I'm recording this at about 6:45 p.m. Central Standard Time here in Norman. And so we should see convective initiation within the next couple of hours, and we'll see that those storms increase in coverage overnight into tomorrow morning. Again, the greatest threat expected to be within the enhanced risk area here in the ArkLaTex, but there is a large slight risk that surrounds that enhanced risk level 2 out of 5. Places like Little Rock, Greenville, Mississippi, down toward Lufkin, almost to the I-35 corridor there, Dallas-Fort Worth toward Waco. For the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex, you're in a marginal risk. Storms are expected to fire in the Dallas-Fort Worth vicinity and then quickly move off to the east, ending the severe threat for you. So you might see a few rumbles of thunder early on, maybe an isolated severe gust or severe hailstone or two early on, and then things will move quickly off to the east, and you will be all done for this event as far as the severe threat goes, you folks in the DFW Metroplex and areas south toward Waco. Again, the threat will be greater off to the east, and that will include an all-hazards threat with this activity. The enhanced risk does include a 10% hatched area for significant tornadoes. In that, coincident with that enhanced risk level, 2% and 5% areas surrounding that, but our greatest threat for maybe a strong tornado or two does exist when these storms will move into the ArkLaTex vicinity. Damaging wind also going to be a threat, maximized in that enhanced risk area. And we may see a few significant severe gusts as the line of storms moves off into southern and southeastern Arkansas and far northern Louisiana. Could see a few 70-plus mile-an-hour gusts in that line as the storms move off there. We also have a large to significant hail threat, especially in the early portion of the convective life cycle, 15% hatched area there covering the area just east of the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex toward the ArkLaTex into southeast Oklahoma, western Arkansas. Could see some large to very large hailstones there in excess of 2 inches in diameter. Then we go into tomorrow, and we've seen some drastic changes in the outlook for tomorrow. In our previous outlooks, we had an enhanced risk that stretched all the way up from basically southeast Alabama up through Georgia and the Carolinas. Well, that has since been removed and has now been replaced with just a level 2 out of 5 slight risk. So you folks in Birmingham, Mobile, Columbus, Atlanta, over toward Charleston, Savannah, Georgia, up into the Carolinas. Now just under a level 2 out of 5 slight risk as the confidence in significant severe weather has decreased from yesterday's outlooks. We do now have an enhanced risk that has been placed farther to the west across, basically centered over northern Mississippi into far northwest Alabama for the continuation of storms from the overnight hours into tomorrow morning into Mississippi and Alabama. They could pack a punch as they head in that direction. Just a broad 2 and 5% tornado risk covering the area. Now that 10% hatched risk has been taken out, so we do not expect a significant tornado threat, although we conditionally could see maybe 1 or 2 strong tornadoes in here if storms can become robust, and that's a big if, and we'll talk about some of the drawbacks here in just a second. Damaging wind. Again, the threat for a few significant wind gusts in excess of 70, maybe even 80 miles an hour there across northern Mississippi and northwest Alabama tomorrow morning. That is the reason for the enhanced risk. And the hail threat will be on the lower side. Not expecting to see a major hail threat tomorrow. The main threats are going to be damaging wind and a few tornadoes. So let's go ahead and dive right into our data. This is our current radar imagery that we're seeing right now. Not seeing much on the radar in our target area here for this severe threat. We are seeing a few of these little showers moving in from the west across the Texas Panhandle, northwest Texas, into southwest Oklahoma. That is showing you that the overall forcing is starting to overspread much of the region. And so in the next few hours, we should see more robust storm development across the actual severe risk area here. We do see a few blips going up across northern Louisiana into central Arkansas. Nothing severe at the moment, but we need to watch this area for some potential continuation of more elevated storms that will be our first batch of storms within this environment here across southeast Oklahoma, northeast Texas, and they will move off to the northeast pretty quickly. Those will be rooted above the surface, so they will be elevated. Therefore, they will not have much of a tornado threat. Instead, they will have more of a large hail threat, and that is the reason for that 15% hatched hail risk across this area. So that will be those elevated storms will be our first batch of storms. And as the forcing starts to continues to overspread the area, we'll start to see storms fired here out toward the I-35 corridor in northern Texas, and then move off to the northeast toward the ArkLaTex, where they could increase in intensity. Here is our 500 millibar, our most recent 500 millibar map from the SPC mesoanalysis page. And here is that big old trough starting to dig into the southern portion of the country and eject into the southern plains. This will, of course, be our main player, at least on the synoptic scale, for this severe weather event. Strong flow rounding the base of this trough. That is in excess of 90 to maybe even 100 plus knots of flow here rounding the base of this trough. So very potent trough making its way in here, and that will mean a lot of forcing associated with this trough as it starts to take on a more negative tilt. With time, as we go into tonight and then tomorrow, it will be a nice negatively tilted trough for us, and that will be our main impetus for severe weather starting in a couple hours' time. But again, a lot of forcing with this event. We've talked about the potential for this trough to be maybe a little bit more favorable for discrete supercell development than our last trough on Monday, Tuesday, where we saw mostly just a line, a few discrete supercells out ahead of the line, but a lot of the severe weather came from just a very solid squall line extending through multiple states into the Gulf of Mexico. This trough, that still remains true, and so our kinematics are not going to be a problem with this particular setup. But the problem is going to be instability, and we'll talk about that here in just a second. So 500 millibar trough making its way into the southern portion of the country. We've started to see, a while ago, we started to see that strong flow traversing the southern Rockies, and so we would expect to see surface low development here as we take a look at our surface map, and that is what we have going on. Very broad surface low, but an intensifying surface low at that. Main center here located somewhere along the Red River in southwest Oklahoma, northwest Texas. Very tight pressure gradient on the backside of this system. Very cold air on the backside of this system that will dig down into the southern plains over the next few days. But this low will continue to strengthen overnight as that trough continues to move east into the southern plains. And we'll see that low take off to the northeast, and we may have another center develop down here somewhere in the Gulf Coast region, moving off to the northeast, and that will be our kind of a secondary surface low, south of which the severe threat will be confined for this event. 850 millibars, strong low-level jet should be in place at this time, and you see that low-level cyclone as it continues to strengthen. We will see that low-level wind field strengthen as well. Already 40 to 45 knots out of the southwest across much of East Texas into eastern Oklahoma, Louisiana, Arkansas, up into Kansas and Missouri, associated with the low-level cyclone as it strengthens. Let's take a look now at our surface data. And the big question mark with this entire setup, even from tonight going into tomorrow, has been instability and the size and geometry of the warm sector. So let's start and take a look at what we have going on right now. So of course, we just talked about, we had our surface low located probably somewhere, we have maybe a center in here. It's a very broad surface low at this point, not super well defined. We do see some cyclonic curvature in here, and so that does match up with what the SPC mesoanalysis page was showing. So we see strong northerly flow, very cold temperatures behind this this surface low here, and a cold front that is situated probably somewhere in here. I'll draw that in blue. We see temperatures in the 20s and 30s up here with snow reported across parts of New Mexico into the northern Texas Panhandle, southwest Kansas. And then we have 50s out in here. So our cold front is probably somewhere back in this region right here. A little hard to put it in exactly right here. There's not much of a wind shift associated with this, especially with southwest extent, but our cold front probably somewhere in there. We now have our dry line that is setting up across parts of northern Texas, and that will be our main initiating boundary for storms as the main forcing comes through, and that will be our main surface-based development along the I-35 corridor, so to speak, and then we'll move off to the northeast into the ArkLaTex, perhaps increasing in intensity. But our dry line looks to be somewhere in here. You see 50s dew points out across northeast Texas right now, 30s and 20s back here to across northwest and west Texas. So our dry line setting up somewhere in this vicinity here at this point. Just kind of eyeballing it as we go along here. Dry line looks to be right in there. We'll draw that maybe a little bit farther north, and that might be the northward extent of our moisture return. You see, north of about the I-40 corridor here in eastern Oklahoma, dew points are very, very minimal in the 40s and 30s. So our warm sector is probably somewhere in this vicinity here. Up here to the north, across the ArkLaTex, still dew points hanging in the mid-50s, which is not all that great for severe storms, surface-based severe storms, at least initially. That's why we're probably going to see some elevated development here across southeast Oklahoma, southwest Arkansas, northeast Texas initially. And those will be elevated with a large hail threat. And then we'll see our surface-based storms develop along the main dry line, and that will move off to the east pretty quickly. And that will be our main round of surface-based development with the all-hazards threat, especially the tornado and strong tornado threat this evening into the morning hours of Friday. So that cold front will continue to surge to the south. Again, very cold air behind this, and the cold air always wins out. That cold air is going to push that cold front off to the south and east, and that will eventually kind of overtake the dry line. And we'll have a very fast eastward progression of the cold front as we go into the day tomorrow. Now, the SPC has kind of been talking about this prefrontal dryline feature for tomorrow's threat, and it is a little bit interesting here. A couple days ago, I looked at the models, and it was, as we talked about in our video yesterday, it looked like the dryline kind of stayed ahead of the cold front. But given what the models are showing now, I think that the cold front does merge with the dry line. We'll get kind of one composite boundary here moving very quickly off to the east. We'll talk about the model data here in just a second, but just an interesting observation. The SPC was looking at a prefrontal dry line type feature, but it looks like the cold front will actually merge with the dry line and become one composite boundary moving to the east, and that will be our main boundary along which storms will form for tomorrow's event. So let's go ahead and look at some sounding data. We have some fresh soundings in, 0Z soundings within the last 30 minutes or so. They have come into the SPC page. Here is our Shreveport, Louisiana sounding at 0Z. So just about 20 minutes ago, this data came in. Shreveport, of course, right there in far northwest Louisiana. A couple things to note right away. The moist layer is fairly deep. We see a fairly deep moist layer there extending up to about 800 millibars or so. Not quite saturated or so, as we often have seen here in the last few days. We saw a lot of deep moisture, but the low levels were very, very saturated, meaning lots of low clouds. Low-level thermodynamics not quite that great. But we do see a decent moist layer with 70/59 at the surface, so that moisture is creeping up slowly across these areas, and that will only continue to increase going forward into the nighttime hours tonight, overnight hours tomorrow morning, and that will allow for storms to become surface-based, especially as they approach the ArkLaTex area. A little bit of instability already in play, about 500 joules per kilogram of mixed layer CAPE here. So decent instability in place, maybe a little bit of a remnant elevated mixed layer there, a very small steep lapse rate layer there, but not much to speak of. We are pretty much ready to go for convective initiation. Once that forcing from the upper trough starts to overspread the region, we will start to see those storms fire along the dry line, as well as out ahead, north of the main moisture return, and those will be elevated. So thermodynamics looking pretty good this evening. Nothing mind-blowing, but certainly adequate for severe storms. Some drier air aloft as well, helping to increase conditional instability. And once those storms fire, they should become fairly robust pretty quickly. Wind profiles looking good. Lengthy hodographs, very long hodographs in excess of 60 knots of effective bulk shear. Already some very solid turning in the low levels of the hodograph, veering and strengthening of the winds in the low levels of the atmosphere. See about 10 knots here at the surface out of the south-southeast, veering to about 35 knots or so at 850 millibars out of the south-southwest. So definitely some directional and speed shear in the low levels, which is allowing for this curvature in the hodograph in excess of 250 meters squared per second squared effective storm relative helicity. So we are all set to go for a possible tornado threat, and these kinematics will only get better with time. We should see those hodographs start to really lengthen as we go into the overnight hours, as that low-level jet really starts to ramp up going into tonight and overnight tomorrow. So the stage is set for severe storms tonight going into tomorrow morning, and that will be our first round of storms associated with this event. Farther to the south, let's take a look at Lake Charles here, and you do see a little bit more of a capping inversion in place. Pretty deep moisture, Moisture in excess, up above 850 millibars there as far as our moist layer goes, but a little bit of capping here. And it's unclear whether that will erode or not. The SPC does have a risk area extending down to the coast, but it does decrease as you go toward the Gulf Coast area. And that is probably because of this capping inversion that will probably be pretty stubborn, as the main forcing will be a little bit to the north of the Gulf Coast, not allowing for full erosion of this cap. So it looks like areas farther to the north certainly will have that greater severe threat because of a little bit less capping in place as we go into storm initiation within the next few hours. So let's look at some model data. We'll look at the 18Z NAM, which is our most recent run. And here is, of course, our trough digging into the southern plains. That will, again, take on a more neutral to negative tilt going into the overnight hours tonight. This is at 3 a.m. Central Standard Time. That trough starting to take on a negative tilt. Very strong flow rounding the base of that trough in excess of 130 knots in the blues there, right at the center of the jet streak. So very, very strong flow. This is a very, very strongly forced event. And now our dry line, if we go back and take a look at our storm mode, so our dry line, we'll draw that back in here, looks something like this. And if we look at our shear vectors, let me go to our SPC mesoanalysis, look at our 0 to 6 kilometer shear vectors, you can see that they're pretty much due westerly at this point. So if we were to go back to our surface data, drawing our due westerly shear vectors, that is a very high amount of perpendicularity of the shear vectors with respect to this initiating boundary. So the storms initially forming along this boundary you'd expect, this dryline boundary, you'd expect to be fairly discrete or semi-discrete in nature. I do think that will be the case for at least a couple of hours with this event, but there is so much forcing associated with this trough that we will probably get a lot of storms to fire along that dry line, and therefore we may see, even though the shear vector orientation is very, very good for discrete storms, we may see a lot of storms fire along that front, and as the cold front overtakes the dry line, that will really ramp up that low-level forcing on the mesoscale with that frontal forcing, and that will allow a lot of storms to fire on that cold front. So I do think initially, as the storms fire along the dry line before the cold front reaches it, that dry line, we should see a couple hours of at least a couple hours of discrete storms here moving into northeast Texas and east Texas as well. And then the cold front overtakes the dry line, and at that point we definitely should see a quick transition to a more linear organization to the storms at that point. So as the storms, again, are more discrete, they will have a greater large hail threat, especially the elevated storms farther to the north, and they will have a greater tornado threat, perhaps strong tornado threat, and any storms that remain strong going into the ArkLaTex area, at which point the kinematics will be very, very strong, we could see that significant tornado threat develop with any more discrete convection. Then we go through the day tomorrow. That trough really takes on that negative tilt going into tomorrow. Very negatively tilted axis there of that trough. Strong forcing overspreading the east. But you notice that the forcing is moving to the northeast, kind of away from the region here. We're just going to get a glancing blow from this region. So that lends a little bit less confidence in the sustenance of the overnight line of storms farther than, say, the Mississippi area, Mississippi, Northwest Alabama area. As the forcing moves away, the storms will probably become, number one, farther removed from the forcing, number two, farther removed from the low-level moisture, and therefore we will see a weakening of the overnight storms going into tomorrow morning, and then we'll see additional development. We should see additional development, the intensity of which is still in question, but we should see additional development here from Alabama northeastward into the Georgia and Carolina corridor, at which point we will see that severe threat ramp up a little bit again. Again, confidence has decreased some with that portion of the risk area, but we should see a few severe storms in that area as well going into tomorrow. But that forcing does lift a little bit farther away from the region, lending a little bit of doubt as far as the maintenance of those storms past the morning hours. So let's go ahead and go down to the surface, show you how the surface low transpires here. So here we are, current time, surface low centered, broad surface low, but centered somewhere here along the Red River in southwest Oklahoma, northwest Texas. That will continue to move off to the northeast, moving into the Midwest, and we should get a secondary low center. So there's our main low up in the Illinois vicinity. Secondary surface low down here along the Mississippi River by about 10 a.m. Eastern, 9 a.m. Central Standard Time tomorrow. Warm sector located south of that secondary surface low associated with the cold front and the warm front out ahead of it. And as I've drawn it there, that looks like a pretty pinched warm sector. Let's take a look at our dew points, and that will really outline the warm sector for us. And that has been a big question with this event, is the overall size and geometry of the warm sector. So here we are, 0Z, those dew points rapidly advecting northward ahead of the surface low as that surface low deepens. So I had a few questions about whether or not we'll see robust storms here in the ArkLaTex because it's been kind of dry, relatively speaking, for much of the day, but that moisture is rapidly moving northward, and as those storms run into that better moisture, they will start to be they will become surface-based and have that robust severe threat associated with them. So that moisture is going to continue to stream northward overnight. Here we are at 3Z, 6Z, so this is about midnight. We'll take a sounding here in the ArkLaTex right around the Texarkana area out ahead of the storms. Again, we'll have storms ongoing to the north up in southeast Oklahoma, western Arkansas that will be elevated north of the better moisture, and then the storms down to the south along the dryline that will move into that better moisture, and that will have our all hazards, perhaps significant hazards, severe threat. And this is why pretty robust instability, which is what we saw on the Shreveport sounding, should get a little bit better as the low level moisture increases. Maybe a little bit of a low level stable layer there, but with such strong low-level shear, that shouldn't be too much of an issue, and especially as the cold front moves in, we should have stronger forcing to drill through that stable layer, and that shouldn't be a problem. But this is not too much of an issue here. It doesn't look like at all. So we should get surface-based supercells to develop on the dry line. Decent instability, 1,400 joules per kilogram of mixed layer CAPE. So adequate instability, nice fat instability in the mid-levels as well, pretty steep lapse rates aloft, low-level instability on the high side as well. According to the NAM model here, over 200 joules per kilogram of 0 to 3 kilometer CAPE. So that is a pretty good-looking thermodynamic profile for robust thunderstorms. And that wind profile, pretty impressive as well. Very strong curvature in the low levels of the hodograph, strong veering and strengthening of the winds with height. By this point, the low-level jet will have started to really ramp up above 50 knots there at 850 millibars, leading to this very strong curvature of the low levels of the hodograph. A little bit of a kink there in the mid-levels, a little bit of a weakening of the flow, right about 700 millibars or just below that. I don't think that's going to have too much of an issue because our initial storm mode should be fairly discrete. And since we can pretty definitively say we'll have discrete storms early on in the life cycle, that shouldn't matter too much as far as low-level mesocyclone maintenance and intensity. But very strong low-level shear, decent instability. This is certainly a sounding that is favorable, certainly an environment that would favor significant severe hazards with elevated storms, large to very large hail, and with surface-based storms, a damaging wind and significant tornado threat. And again, this is at midnight tonight. So those storms will have fired along the dry line and will move into this environment going into the early morning hours tomorrow, and that will be when our significant severe threat will maximize. So you see the cold front back here. You can see that dry air really raging its way to the southeast, if you will. So here's our dry line, cold front back in here, and you see that dry air takes over the dry line by about tomorrow morning, sometime right about the morning commute or so. That dry line should get overtaken by the cold front, and that's at that point the composite boundary will really start to surge to the east. You see not much movement here. Cold front overtakes it, very quick eastward movement. And that is not going to allow us to get robust moisture inland, south of the surface low and east of the cold front dryline composite boundary. And that has been a question with this event, as we said. So before we go on, just quickly, let's take a sounding here just ahead, going into the morning hours across northern Mississippi, ahead of that squall line. Just want to give you an idea of what the environment will look like and why we have that strong tornado threat going into the overnight hours. That is why. Extremely strong low-level shear as that low-level jet ramps up to in excess of, looks like 75 knots here or so at 850 millibars. In excess of 500 meters squared per second squared, storm relative velocity. Very, very strong low-level shear. So any remaining discrete supercells and any stronger circulations within the line could produce a significant tornado or two. So we'll have to watch that for sure going into tomorrow morning. Anywhere from the ArkLaTex eastward into northern Louisiana, southern Arkansas into northern Mississippi. Damaging wind gusts going to be very much a threat as well, as this very strong flow will get transported downward to the surface through downdrafts and mixed downward to the surface through downdrafts. So we could see some 70, 80 plus mile an hour wind gusts with the squall line as it moves off to the east tomorrow morning. But speaking of our warm sector, this has been the problem. I'm going to shift sectors here to the southeast sector, close these out. So as you see here, the cold front dry line boundary moves off to the east, and it's just so progressive that we can't get enough moisture out ahead of it to form a robust warm sector. This is at 21Z Friday, so this will be 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time tomorrow. And let me show you what we saw a couple of days ago. So this is what the models were showing a couple of days ago. This was what the warm sector looked like on our 18Z NAM run a couple days ago. So this was from January 9th at 18Z. So midday run of the NAM on January 9th, 2 days ago. Our warm sector was very, very expansive, extending from the Florida Panhandle, southern Alabama, all the way over to the Gulf Coast. You see robust moisture making its way inland, very wide warm sector, which would provide plenty of room for discrete supercells, both along this boundary and out ahead in the open warm sector. Well, let's jump ahead to 2 days to our 18Z NAM run from today, and we see a much, much different story. I'll draw it in blue here. Here's our warm sector as modeled on the 18Z NAM. It has been pinched off with every successive run, and so that is going to be why the SPC has downgraded severe probabilities for the Alabama to Carolinas corridor, is because we just don't have enough confidence in a robust warm sector making its way inland. And that's just one of the reasons they've downgraded this threat. So we just don't have enough real estate to get, and the cold front dry line is moving so quickly that we just don't have enough time to get robust moisture before it's out into the Atlantic. So we're just not able to get a robust warm sector to take shape with this setup because of the fast eastward progression of the cold front. So that is why we've seen a decrease in severe probabilities. So going into the morning hours, we should see that swell line continue to be strong through the morning, through northern Mississippi, northwest Alabama. And then going into the afternoon, we should see maybe a lull in storm activity. And then as the forcing overspreads the region once again, we should see storms develop here. And again, it's not going to be very much room to do so, but those storms may see a reinvigoration along the line. And that might be about it. And if we see a little bit more moisture, a little bit more robust inland advance of the warm sector, like what we saw 2 days ago on the models, then we'll have a better chance for some more robust discrete supercell action out ahead of that line. But right now, it just does not look like the warm sector is going to be able to make its way inland that far, and it won't be that sizable enough for robust activity in over a wide area. That's why they have taken away the enhanced risk across this area. But the environment in the warm sector is still going to be pretty strong. So let's take a sounding from the warm sector. This is at 3 p.m. Central Time, 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time tomorrow. And so this is another reason why confidence has decreased in the overall severe threat here. This is not a thermodynamic profile that you would expect to see with significant tornado events. We see lots of warm air aloft, very minimal, weak lapse rates in the mid-levels of the atmosphere. That has to do a little bit with the forcing being farther removed from the area. We saw that 500 millibar trough, and I'll pull it up here. So keep in mind our warm sector, mid-afternoon, is right in here. I'll pull up the 500 millibar map. So our main jet streak is well relegated to the north of the warm sector. So the overall forcing and the cooler air associated with that trough and the forcing that would help to cool the mid-level temperatures is removed from the area. And so we're going to have a lot of warm air in the mid-levels remain. And this is just not a very good looking profile for significant severe storms and robust updrafts. It will probably temper updraft intensity, very minimal instability, only 400 joules per kilogram of mixed layer CAPE, and it is very, very skinny where there is some. Couple that with that warm air aloft, and you have a pretty unfavorable thermodynamic environment for robust tornadic supercells. Wind profile not looking all that great as well. A couple days ago we had veered low-level winds, but still quite a bit of curvature in the low levels, which was, even though we had some veered winds on the models, still plenty of curvature for a robust severe threat there within the warm sector. But now we see very much, not much curvature in the low levels of the HODRAF, not much veering of the low-level winds with height, lots of speed shear, but this is just not a good look for robust severe weather. And that's why tonight they've increased the probabilities for tonight into tomorrow morning across the ArkLaTex, because we have a very favorable look to the ingredients there. And just I'll pull up the sounding here from midnight in the ArkLaTex just so we can compare the two environments. So this is tomorrow in the warm sector across the southeast. Minimal instability, minimal low-level curvature of the HODRAF, not a favorable look for significant tornadoes. Compare that to this. A little bit different than what we just saw, but you get the idea. Strong curvature in the low level, strong veering and strengthening of the low-level winds with height, robust instability. This is a significant tornado environment. This simply is not. So those are some of the reasons why we have seen a downtrend in the threat across Alabama going into Georgia and the Carolinas, because we have, number one, a very minimal warm sector as far as its size goes, so we don't have enough real estate for a lot of storms to develop across the warm sector. And number two, we're going to see a very unfavorable thermodynamic profile, especially given warm air aloft, as we're relegated to the south of the main jet streak that would help to lift and cool those kind of warm layers in the mid-levels. And so that is why the tornado threat has diminished across this area tomorrow. Now, we still could see, this is just one model, remember, we still could see a little bit better instability than what we have modeled here. And if that happens, we could see a little bit more robust threat develop, some more chances for discrete supercells with a tornado threat as well. Here we are at 0Z, again, not much inland advance of the warm sector. I just want to see if the overall wind profiles improve at all. And so we do have robust wind profiles here, and this was taken across, I believe, in northern Florida. Far southern Georgia there. And so we do see an improvement going into the evening hours, at least on the NAM run here. A little bit better instability, over 1,300 joules per kilogram mixed layer Cape, a little bit farther to the south where the robust moisture is. Very strong low-level shear. And so if we can get storms to initiate and sustain, again, that's a big question given somewhat unfavorable thermodynamics, especially during the afternoon hours. If we can get robust supercells to maintain themselves and become pretty stout as far as their intensity goes, then we will be able to realize the tornado threat and damaging wind threat with those supercells. And again, the threat is very, very conditional, extremely conditional, much more conditional than it was a day or two ago, but there is, if we can get a robust supercell, this wind profile would certainly favor strong tornadoes. Even though the low-level winds are a little bit out of the southwest, we do have strong veering and strengthening of the winds with height amid that very strong low-level flow, and therefore we would be able to maybe eke out a strong tornado or two. So a strong tornado threat in the southeast is certainly not off the table at all, but it looks like the thermodynamics may hold this back from being a much bigger event, and that may negate the overall storm intensity as a whole, but also the tornado threat as well. So let's take a look finally at some convection allowing models. We'll take a look at our most recent run of the HRRR here. The 0Z run is coming in. I don't believe our other cams are quite in yet, so we'll have to look at the 12Z run of those. But our 0Z HRRR, this is fresh, hot off the press going into tonight, into tomorrow. Might not even be far enough out for us to look fully through tomorrow. But here we go. You see lots of elevated storms here across southeast Oklahoma into Arkansas, north of the best moisture. So those will be elevated, have a large hail threat. And then by about midnight or so, we should see storms fire along the dry line here across northern Texas, close to the I-35 corridor. Again, Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex, you might see some rumbles of thunder, some heavy rain, some lightning, maybe some instances of large hail or damaging wind gust or two, but the threat will quickly move off to the east. And the HRRR run here looks to really rapidly transition into more of a squall line here, which would negate the overall significant tornado threat because, as we know, squall lines usually have more brief embedded circulations that don't tend to last as long. But given the kinematics at play, we could see a strong spin-up tornado or two in the squall line. And we could also see some storms, as modeled here on the HRRR, out ahead of the line, which would have a strong tornado damaging wind threat as well if we can get some discrete storms out ahead of the line. A little bit surprising to me that we have such a quick transition to a squall line. This might be when the cold front is overtaking the dry line. And let me just look at that to see. So that was about midnight. So there's our dry line. And yeah, by that point, it looks like the cold front is starting to already overtake the dry line. And that is why the HRRR is quickly transitioning those storms to more of a squall line rather than discrete supercells. But if we can get supercells to fire along the dry line before the cold front overtakes it, those would have a tendency to be more discrete. So interesting progression here. Then we go into tomorrow. Very strongly forced line with some embedded rotating elements there. You see some stronger cores in there with some updraft helicity streaks. Maybe a few prefrontal discrete supercells, but again, we don't have a lot of real estate for that to happen. But we will continue the tornado threat into tomorrow morning with that line, and then the line should diminish going into tomorrow afternoon. I'll back it up to the 18Z run of the HRRR and switch sectors so we can at least get an estimate of what might happen tomorrow. So here is that squall line moving through, potential for discrete supercells out ahead of it. Again, we just don't see a lot of robust activity here. Not even an updraft helicity streak in this entire picture here. Not even a full-fledged squall line moving to the east. So we're definitely going to see a lull after the morning activity, and whether or not it picks back up, the HRRR definitely not showing a lot of robust activity out into the afternoon hours tomorrow, which is a good sign. That will definitely mean a lesser severe threat Just not a lot of robust updrafts in this entire area. So very interesting progression to that HER run there. These are going to be the 12Z runs. We don't have the 0Z runs in yet, but just for curiosity's sake, let's go ahead and take a look here at things with this. And you see the squall line overnight. And wow, not much at all. Once again, very little robustness in the updrafts there with the WRF ARW model. And let's go to the NSSL WRF, one last cam we'll look at for tomorrow. And we see that squall line moving through, and wow, yeah. So this is pretty much what we're talking about. We might have the kinematic environment at play by late in the afternoon. We saw those strongly curved photographs in the warm sector, but again, it was a very modestly sized warm sector, and lots of warm air aloft are going to likely play a role in negating the intensity of the updrafts across this area. So that is why the confidence has decreased in an overall severe threat there tomorrow. If we can get robust updrafts to sustain, they would have an all-hazards severe threat, especially tornadoes and damaging winds. But right now, most of the models and the meteorology we looked at just a little bit ago does not tell us that we're going to see a lot of robust updrafts tomorrow afternoon across the southeast states. One thing to close this out, I have heard some rumblings about a possible cold core tornado threat up in the Ohio River Valley area. And the Day 2 outlook does have a lobe of the marginal risk that does extend up here into parts of Kentucky, far southern Indiana. Let's take a look at that real quick. The overall components are there for a kind of a cold core event. We see by tomorrow morning, this is at 18Z, so about midday tomorrow, we see that trough, negative tilt trough moving into the east, southeast U.S., strongly negatively tilted trough there, and very cold air aloft associated with this trough. All those dark grays there are very, very cold air, minus 24, minus 20 plus, and even colder air associated with those dark grays near the center of that trough. So very, very cold air overspreading the region aloft. At the surface, we have our surface low. Main surface low center is up here in Illinois. And our secondary surface low down here to the south, but this would be our main player for our cold core threat farther to the north. So we do have the basics of a cold core setup there. Cold air aloft, 500 millibar trough, centered somewhere in here. Our surface low just off to the east. We like to have those in fairly close proximity, as outlined by the work by John Davies when he did his cold core work. Those need to be close together. Not perfect by any means, but certainly cold air aloft, surface low in play, backflow out ahead of the surface low would, at least on the background pattern level, suggest maybe a cold core tornado threat. But the problem here is going to be getting instability that far north. I'm going to zoom into our Midwest sector here. And this is the problem. You can see the NAM, we barely get low to mid 40s dew points up this far into Kentucky, southern Illinois, southern Indiana through the day tomorrow. And that does not lead to robust instability development across this area. I've seen a lot of people post the HRRR maps of instability from today. The HER is definitely on the very high end of the guidance as far as instability goes. We'll look at the 18Z HER here. And we do see a little bit of those red lines. That's the lifted index, meaning some instability in play. We see that with the HER. We don't see that on the NAM, and the RAP certainly not on board as well. Very minimal instability at best on the latest RAP run. Just to look at another model, GFS, not showing much at all as well. Very limited moisture up into this area. So the HER is definitely on the higher end of the guidance. Keep that in mind. The HRRR is definitely on the higher end of the guidance as far as instability goes. And if we were to take a sounding here from the NAM, I'll take one here at 18Z, just from, how about far western Kentucky. And again, this is relegated southeast of the surface low, so not really your typical type of cold core setup where you'd want to be right ahead of the surface low. This is relegated to the south, not a classic look to the cold core threat there. And so this is, this is pretty self-explanatory here. This is, let me make sure this is in the right spot. This looks so bad. Let me just make sure it's in the right spot. This just no instability here. With a cold core threat, you'd see limited instability, but it would all be relegated in the low levels of the atmosphere, very fat instability in the lowest few kilometers of the atmosphere, and we just don't have that at all here. Wind profile, not even all that favorable as well. To me, I don't see much of a cold core tornado threat with tomorrow's setup. Now, it doesn't take much in these cold core setups to get tornadoes. You only need a couple hundred joules per kilogram mixed layer cape, but most of the models here not showing any. We'll show you the wrap. Let me show the wrap run just to see here what it's showing, but it just does not look to me like we'll have enough instability. Even though you don't need much with cold core events, we just won't have enough instability. I mean, you don't see any at all here in this sounding. So I don't believe that enough instability will develop this far north to support a robust cold core tornado threat tomorrow. But again, it doesn't take much. And again, our features are a little bit off. Surface low is up in here, moisture tongue is down in here. Not what you'd usually see with a typical cold core event. You'd want to be up on the surface low, but we, of course, can't get moisture up that far north. So it just doesn't look to me like a classic cold core tornado event. So I would definitely take the HRR run with a grain of salt. And let's just, for giggles, let's go back to the HRR. Let's go to the 18Z HRR, and we'll go to our Midwest sector just to pull a sounding from up there. And so morning storms, that is not uncommon with a cold core type event. Lots of rain and storms in the morning. You get a couple hours of sunshine behind it. And yeah, nothing robust here. And not that the cams would show a lot of robust stuff there. They don't, with such minimal instability in these cold core setups, they don't often produce a lot of robust updrafts in these cold core events. But just to take a sounding here out ahead of this activity, we'll take it at 20Z right there, Western Kentucky. So the HRR is definitely on the higher end of the guidance. You see a little bit more instability there, but still it's definitely on the low side. Sub 100 joules per kilogram there at 20Z, which is 2 p.m. Central Time. That just is not going to cut it, I don't believe, for a cold core threat. So just wanted to touch on that. I've seen a lot of people talking about the cold core threat tomorrow. I just don't believe it's going to materialize across that area, given a lack of low-level moisture and robust enough instability. So that's going to do it for this video. So that's going to be our final update for this setup. I know it was a little late today. Unusual to get a video up in the evening, but I was traveling all day back to Oklahoma City and now just got back, so wanted to do a video before this event got underway. Once again, enhanced risk level 3 out of 5 for the rest of tonight into tomorrow morning, centered on the ArkLaTex. Again, it looks like we'll have a couple bands of storms here. Initially, elevated storms across southeast Oklahoma, much of western and central Arkansas, far northern Louisiana. Those will have a large hail threat. 15% hatched area for large hail is in play there for those elevated storms. Then it looks like we will see a second band of storms form along the dry line, pretty close to the I-35 corridor is where it's set up now. Again, Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex storms will fire pretty close to you, but then quickly move off to the east, ending the severe threat. So not much to worry about in the Dallas-Fort Worth, Waco areas this evening. But as the storms along the dry line move into this better moisture that is currently rapidly advecting northward, they should also encounter a more favorable low-level shear environment for perhaps a strong tornado threat within the enhanced risk area. We do have that 10% hatched risk for tornadoes in the enhanced risk area, and also a damaging wind threat, especially as they move into tomorrow morning into western or eastern Arkansas, into northern Mississippi. Storm mode going to play a role here. If we can get storms to develop on the dry line before the cold front overtakes it, then we could see some discrete supercells, which may have a greater threat for producing strong tornadoes and damaging winds. But once that cold front overtakes the dry line, the forcing will increase rapidly, and we'll see a rapid transition to a squall line with maybe some embedded circulations, perhaps a couple strong embedded circulations, and some significant damaging winds. Then we go into tomorrow. That the overnight line of storms will continue into northern Mississippi. In northwest Alabama, it will be moving, the forcing will be moving away from this area, and it will also be moving northeast away from the low-level moisture return. So we should see a gradual weakening beyond about northwest Alabama of those storms. And then a lot of the models not showing much redevelopment of anything here from Alabama into Georgia and the Carolinas. We do have, it looks like, impressive kinematics at play by late afternoon. So if any robust supercells can develop, we might see a tornado threat, conditional strong tornado threat, but that is a very, very conditional statement, as well as some damaging winds and maybe a hail report or two. But it looks like instability in the size of the warm sector is going to hold this event back, and that's why we've seen a decrease in severe probs across this area. Warm sector just does not extend far inland, and it's going to be very, very progressive, not allowing enough time for robust moisture return out ahead of the cold front dryline composite boundary as it moves east rapidly. Also, warm air aloft, as the forcing will be relegated well to the north. We won't see that those warm layers in the mid-levels be able to be lifted and cooled as we would if we were up in the exit region of the trough. So it does not look like the thermodynamic environment will support robust convection across this area tomorrow. But again, if a supercellular 2 can sustain itself and become robust, we will see that all hazards threat develop with those storms. And again, don't expect a cold core. I don't expect a cold core threat up here into Kentucky so much. But again, if we can get a little bit more instability than is expected, then we may see a robust updraft or two up there with maybe a brief tornado risk and a damaging or maybe a small hail risk as well. So that's going to do it for this video. And if you live in any of these areas, certainly just because we've had a decrease in probabilities, that does not mean we won't see severe weather. We're definitely going to see severe weather with this event, and prepare as such in these areas from the ArkLaTex, from East Texas and the ArkLaTex tonight into the Southeast tomorrow. Certainly severe weather is still on the table and likely will occur, but we've seen, again, a decrease in confidence in the overall robustness of that severe threat. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.